Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and esteemed colleagues, welcome to the Belgrade Security Conference. This year's conference features an exciting range of expert panels and discussions that tackle some of the most significant security challenges.
This year, we have more than 20 panels, lectures, and keynote speeches as diverse as conflicts in Eastern Europe and Middle East, transatlantic relations, Europe's future, super-election year, and the consequences of choices made by almost half of humanity. What are the challenges of today and tomorrow, considering security, energy, climate changes, common values, and democracy? Discussing various subjects, our distinguished guests, panelists, moderators, and lecturers, more than 500 participants, will all stand in defense of humanity.
Now I invite the President of the International Advisory Board of the Belgrade Center for Security Policy, Mr. Srđan Cvijić, to address us. Please welcome him with a round of applause.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Belgrade Security Conference 2024. Antonio Gramsci, an Italian philosopher and politician who was an ardent critic of Mussolini's fascist dictatorship, wrote the following words from his prison cell in the 1930s. "The old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." There is something worryingly contemporary to Gramsci's words. We are indeed surrounded by monsters. The monsters of war in the East and South, and the monsters of authoritarianism at home, marked by the rise of autocracy, extremist populism, nationalism, and social polarization. Our children, new generations like those prior to World War II, when Gramsci wrote these words, are growing up with no certainty of a peaceful and prosperous future. But we cannot allow ourselves to despair. This is the last moment to raise up in defense of humanity. The Belgrade Center for Security Policy was founded back in 1997, in the darkest hours of Milosevic's rule, by Yugoslav army officers who refused to fight in our fratricidal wars. Over the years, BCSP evolved into one of the region's largest foreign and security policy think tanks. And we proudly carry the torch lit by these brave men more than a quarter of a century ago. The Belgrade Security Conference is in fact a true Balkan security conference. It is a home for the entire region of the Western Balkans and a place to discuss international, regional, and national affairs. Every year, the Belgrade Security Conference is proud to host many participants and speakers from the region. This year, in an attempt to further regionalize the conference, we published a call inviting Western Balkans organizations to submit their proposals for panels at the Belgrade Security Conference. The best ones from Albania, Kosovo, North Macedonia were selected, and they will feature on the last day of the conference. BCSP and the Belgrade Security Conference stand by the core values on which we were founded: peace, democracy, and human rights. Any attempt to compromise on each of these values, as we see while observing the world around us, threatens to awaken the monsters of history and drag us back into humanity's darkest hours. There can be no peace internationally with autocracies at home. Hybrid regimes, as we recently experienced in Georgia, but our country too, are not a separate type of government, but merely a stage in the process of the destruction of democracy and the building of authoritarian regimes. With hybrid regimes, there can be no lasting peace and security, just shaky interregnums to which we are only buying time until the next war. The more tyrannies there are in this world, the more likely are we to slide into war and destruction. There is something symbolic about the Sava Center, our new venue. It was built to host the first summit after Helsinki of the then Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, today's OSCE, back in 1977. So this place here was dubbed in the past as the Yugoslav Glass Palace. And the Sava Center was built to be a palace of peace, bridging the East-West divide during the Cold War. Like every year, we dedicate the Belgrade Security Conference to a remarkable person in the field of foreign and security policy. Budimir Lončar, the last foreign minister of Yugoslavia, was one of the architects of the non-aligned movement. In the late 1980s, he was a diplomatic driving force behind Yugoslav attempts to join the then European Economic Community. And tomorrow we will have a commemorative lecture in his honor and a panel on the future of non-alignment and neutrality in the 21st century. The Belgrade Security Conference Young Leaders Program is an essential part of our mission, not only to discuss the challenges of our time, but to actively shape the future. By bringing together 30 young people from across the Western Balkans each year, we are investing in those who will carry forward the torch of peace, democracy, and human rights in a region still struggling with divisions and shadows of past conflicts. This year, they will also have their own panel discussion on the final day of the conference, where participants will share their perspectives on how young people view the future of the region and the opportunities for reconciliation. In his novel, Beware of the Pity, written as World War II was breaking out, Austrian writer Stefan Zweig wrote, "For the first time in my life, I began to realize that it is not evil and brutality, but nearly always weakness that is to blame for the worst things that happen in this world." Weakness, ladies and gentlemen, is our biggest enemy. We mustn't allow ourselves to be weak and apathetic. Each one of us has a role in stopping our world slide towards the abyss. Those who fight for peace are the heroes of our time. And those who fight for democracy are saving our future. With these words, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I declare the Belgrade Security Conference 2024 open.
So we are starting with our first panel, the world after the US and EU elections. Both elections are poised to reshape global dynamics, policies, and allies in ways we have yet to comprehend fully. This is why we brought together a group of renowned experts who will share their insights on potential changes and their far-reaching implications. It is my honor to introduce our distinguished panelists. Federica Mogherini, Rector of the College of Europe and Director of the European Union Diplomatic Academy. Thomas Countryman, Board Chairman of the Arms Control Association. Thomas Gomard, Director of French Institute of International Relations. Wojciech Przybylski, Editor-in-Chief of Visegrad Insight and President of the Res Publica Foundation. A moderator of this panel is esteemed Rosa Balfour, Director of Carnegie Europe.
Good evening. I'm very honored to be moderating this opening panel. And I think we're going to start by addressing immediately the issue that is on everybody's mind. The US elections took place just a couple of weeks ago, and there is a resounding victory on part of Donald Trump, who will start his second administration in January. And the world has been watching this election as the most momentous election of 2024, as the most impactful election of 2024. But although Trump has said many things, we are still somewhat left guessing as to what his foreign policy agenda might be. So what I'd like to do is just start by asking our guests, our panelists, what are the sort of top three issues that we might expect Donald Trump to pursue, which are the top issues that will be most impactful as far as the global impact of the United States under Donald Trump. And to do so, I would like to start with Thomas Countryman. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rosa. Let me first emphasize I speak only for myself, not for any organization I'm part of. The election of 2024 in the United States was a clear victory for Donald Trump, but it was not a landslide, nor a mandate to govern unilaterally. He won less than 50% of the total national vote. He is looking forward to capturing state institutions in the same way that authoritarian leaders he admires have captured state institutions in other countries. But that depends very much upon having a Congress that is unquestioningly obedient, like the Russian Duma. And that's not a given. He will have a substantial majority in the US Senate and a slim majority in the US House. And whether he can deliver on everything he wants to do will depend upon how successfully he can intimidate members of his party in both chambers. Keep in mind also that Mr. Trump says a lot of things. He does not always deliver. If you recall, 8 years ago, his three major campaign promises were to build a wall against the Mexican border, to keep people from Islamic countries out of the US, and to revive the US coal industry. He made minor progress on the first and no progress at all on the other two. From his early statements in the last 2 weeks, it's clear he's dead serious about two of his promises. One, to expel millions of immigrants who do not have legal residency in the United States. And two, to use the Department of Justice and the military to exact revenge upon people he identifies as being his opponents. And again, it is not clear, no matter what his own propaganda says, that he can accomplish either of those goals. So that said, what are the areas where he's most likely to take action that will affect all of us in the rest of the world. First, of course, is Ukraine. He has promised to solve it within 24 hours. I think even he knows that it is more complex than that, and that there are costs, political and otherwise, to a US president who simply surrenders Ukrainian territory to Russian imperialist expansion. A negotiation, a genuine negotiation between Ukraine and Russia is far more difficult than that. And much will depend upon the response of the European Union and the European members of NATO to whatever Mr. Trump puts forward. The second area I would emphasize is the Middle East. One reason that Kamala Harris lost, and there are many reasons you can point to in an election that was this close, is that many young voters and many of Arab or Islamic origin stayed home or voted against Harris because of President Biden's strong support for Prime Minister Netanyahu. The irony is that Mr. Trump has promised even stronger support for Netanyahu and even greater antipathy towards Palestinian aspirations. So I don't expect to see even an effort to restrain Netanyahu as President Biden did. And I expect simultaneously stronger pressure on Iran and some kind of effort to negotiate directly with Iran. The third area I would note would be China, but not in the usual security sense. Instead, I'll emphasize the economic sense. Mr. Trump says he seems not to understand how tariffs work, that they are paid by American consumers, not by foreign countries. But he does understand that tariffs can give you negotiating leverage. So, for example, he will use tariff threats to try to force Mexico and other countries to accept back into their country those millions of immigrants. Similarly, I think that many in his administration see tariffs as a leverage against China for whatever else he wants to get from China. Tariffs, of course, mean a global trade war, inflation in the United States, and a viral inflation around the world. And this, if he follows through on his statements, will be the most dramatic effect. I'll stop there. There's many more I could list, but you asked for 3.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And I'd like to, during the course of this discussion, perhaps we can talk a little bit more about Ukraine and Russia. But first, I'd really like to hear from the other panelists what they think their top 3 issues are. You mentioned Ukraine, Middle East, China, and economics, and turning now to the other side of the pond. Let's start with Federica, who used to be the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy of the European Union. So I'd like to ask you a sort of EU-wide perspective, and maybe also touch upon NATO. But what do you think, from your point of view, are those 3 top issues?
Yes, first of all, I agree very much with what has already been said, and let me stress also here, I used to be, now I speak only on my personal capacity, not representing any of the European institutions, nor the College of Europe, for which I now serve as a rector. If I have to stick to 3, I would say tariffs and the impact of that kind of approach to trade will have on the world in general, on Europe in particular, but not only, and the logic of that. And then I would probably say, for sure, Ukraine, the Russia policy, the Middle East, Iran, but I would say there are, I think, 2 more general aspects that then encompass consequences on different scenarios. And I would say, on one side, what I believe Trump has as a refusal of any sort of respect for the rules, if I can be completely blunt, which has implications on respect for international law. And this has implications in Ukraine, in the Middle East, elsewhere in the world. I believe that he will try to follow what he has said on different geopolitical theaters, following the principle that, at the end of the day, the norms-based international order, international law, is simply not relevant. And the second element that I believe will be, no, the third, that I believe will have an impact in different areas of the world, starting from Europe, but actually starting from the United States, are values. Human rights, rule of law, democracy, diversity and inclusion. This, I mean, clearly he has made not only a statement, but is also choosing people in these first days, even before being sworn in, that are indicating that he's serious on that. And I believe that what the President of the United States will not only say, but also do on these fundamental values that have brought us together as the transatlantic community will have an impact, a very strong and divisive impact in the US society, but also potentially across the European societies and in the world, in terms of encouraging less liberal approaches or violations of human rights or shortcomings and loopholes in the democratic systems.
Thank you, Federica. That's very interesting, actually.
Not uplifting, but...
The values and the societal level, and I think that's very much a theme that is recurrent in this conference here today. Wojciech, I'd like to ask you also, from your point of view, top 3 areas. Perhaps, Poland has been an ardent supporter of the transatlantic community. Is Poland, are Polish people worried about the fate of the transatlantic community? I'm throwing this in addition to.
Well, it's an excellent question, and yes, we are worried. Poland is geopolitically fragile. Just look at the map. And so we depend on the existence of norms and values that are backed by power, also military power. And in that sense, yes, it's a worrying signal, not really of the US elections, but of the potential divergence of foreign policy paths of different actors that construct the transatlantic space. We see that already in Central Europe. There are various actors that try to follow different logic. Some still believe in globalism, and there are countries in Central Europe that still would like European Union to continue on the path of the last 30 or so years. But this seems to be impossible, and I think it's very felt in Poland, where the cheap security comes from US, cheap energy comes from Russia, cheap manufacturing comes from China. None of that is cheap anymore. There is a strong sense of readjustment, also in policies that we see in Poland. The other 2 fears that we observe from the Polish perspective on both a US foreign policy, but also many other actors across Europe, is the fear of isolationism. That can be read through America First policy, but we have a number of actors in Europe that would rather try to pursue isolationism, withdrawal from either a stance on values or on military power that guarantees that these values are protected and defended. And there is also something that clearly has a transatlantic reverberance, which is nationalist foreign policy strategy, pursued also, and that can be emboldened in the choices of our key partners on whom we partly also depend. So from the Polish perspective, 2 key elements, which is power or partnerships backed by power, are of essence. You can see this is our only sense of security we might find. And this is a foundation on which there is a strong bet on the Polish leadership side that we can continue to speak in transatlantic terms. But in summary, 3 key realizations that we see and we are expecting in the US, I think that's more or less obvious, is America first, and that comes with certain fears for foreign policy strategy. China comes second, and the focus and the type of activity on relations with China will have a great impact we may not yet fully embrace, especially in our countries. And Europe comes third.
Yeah.
And that's also important where this comes. It is a change or readjustment of the order of priorities that we have seen so far.
Thomas, I'd like to bring this same question to you as well. You're based in Paris, so you have a very European perspective. France has always seen, itself as a country at the center of Europe. And what, from your perspective and from the perspective of France, what are the top three expectations from the Trump presidency and top three fears?
Thank you, Rosa. Well, at the core of the French strategic culture, you have this idea since many decades that one day maybe the US could leave Europe. It is at the core of what was done, since many decades by the Fifth Republic. That's not what is wanted by France, but it's basically, the confirmation of a sort of historical analysis which was made a long time ago. That leads me to the second point in line with what was said by Federica. I think that what is expected now in France and more broadly in Europe, it is the fact that the re-election of Donald Trump will create a lot of little Trumps everywhere. What is the most striking thing to me, with this election, it is the combination between Trump, Musk, Vance, Thiel, and the fact that this election was won by someone who promoted identity and also who promoted a sort of futurist vision of the world, which is something very difficult for Europe to understand properly, I think, because we are very focused on the figure of Donald Trump, all the bad things he made. But I think we don't understand this futurist approach, this idea that, technologies will be at the core. We will see the balance of power, in the coming administration. But for me, the real key point for Europeans is precisely on this, once again, on this combination between Trump and Musk. What does it mean, in technological terms, in media terms, in political terms of the future? And the last point is was also said previously by the other panelists, but I think that what is very important is to try to anticipate the interaction between what will happen in Ukraine and what will happen between Israel, Palestine, and Iran. To put things bluntly, I think that what happened in Donbass has some effect in Gaza and reciprocally. And on that's very difficult to predict because to some extent the Biden administration refused an escalation in Ukraine. Until yesterday, we will see. I think that the escalation was coming from the Russian side, with the North Korean troops announced, with the systematic strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure. But the Biden administration on the other side lets the impression that it's possible for Israel to escalate in Lebanon and possibly in Iran. So indeed, I think that the most difficult thing to predict will be the attitude of the Trump administration regarding certainly the pressure coming from the Netanyahu government to go further towards Iran.
Thomas, keep the microphone because I do want to continue on this. And I think it would be, we've talked about, how the US is going to pan out. We've identified a number of themes, a number of geographies, and a number of areas as well. You mentioned technology, media. We've mentioned, values, but also transatlantic relationship, NATO, Ukraine, Middle East, etc. But there is one thing that we need to ask ourselves because since Trump's first election in 2016 and then Biden's victory in 2020, Europeans have been going on and on about Trump-proofing Europe, Trump-proofing the transatlantic relationship, Trump-proofing NATO, and then Trump gets re-elected and very few people are saying that actually Europe is ready. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective, is Europe fit to deal with all the various potential impacts of a Trump administration that we've been discussing in the first round. And I'd like to start with you with France, actually. If you could say a few words, including the notion of weakness that also Serjan mentioned in the opening remarks to this conference, because France is, the French government at the moment is in a position of weakness in the sense that it doesn't have a clear majority and a clear way forward.
You're right. I mean, there is a lack of political leadership in Europe right now. There is a political situation in France which is not easy, to say the least. The same can be said for Germany. Maybe things are more clear for Italy. For Poland, we will see. But yes, there is a sort of vacuum to some extent, even if the new commission will be appointed. And for your more broader question about preparation, the EU, it's very easy to blame, the EU institutions. So just before doing that, remind, what was said about the EU during the pandemics, for instance. It was supposed to be a disaster. And at the end of the day, when you compare with what was done by the EU, by comparison with the US, with China and others, it's not so bad. So I would be more nuanced, in my criticize. My main critics is maybe about, the timeline, because I belong to those who said very strongly in my country that the war in Ukraine has not started, in February 2022, but in February 2014. So in a sense, we have already 10 years of a war, and for Europeans, it was seen as, no, it's more than a frozen conflict. But for Europeans, the real question is, in fact, that the so-called neighborhood policy, which was promoted by the EU, targeting 6 countries, so Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, you have now, 5 conflicts in these 6 countries. So it's a big failure for Europeans. This inability since 2 decades to stabilize their direct neighborhood. And second point, yes, in terms of preparation, I said that publicly in my country because we had some discussion about the so-called économie de guerre, warfare economy, which is a joke, in Europe. And this inability in Europe to understand the gravity of what is happening in Ukraine is, in my opinion, a lack of strategic culture. And we will see, because now we are approaching the point where decision will be taken. Maybe Europe will have to act by itself, and is not prepared at all to do so.
Thank you, Thomas. Before asking Federica about the strategic culture, I want to turn to Poland. Wojciech, I came to Warsaw just a couple of months ago, and there were very high expectations from the Polish government on part of all the participants in the conference that you organized. And obviously, Poland is going to be taking the presidency of the rotating presidency of the European Union starting from January, and is this sort of frontline state. But I have to say, my impression was that Poland is also very consumed by its own problems, because it's come out of several years of a government which has attempted state capture of institutions, of the media. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that democracy continues to be vibrant in Poland. So, what kind of leadership can we expect from Poland? What kind of strength can we see from Poland in the months to come?
And I have only 2 minutes to say that. I think on democracy restoration, just watch it closely, because it's a fascinating process, and it's not complete. It's also not complete because we are ahead of presidential elections, and currently we have a cohabitation in the government, which prevents the government to implement policies it promised in the elections, until at least there is a president from the same camp. And we will see if that is happening by May, June next year. So this is a very precarious moment from the point of view of political leadership in a country that wants to run an ambitious European agenda that entails also a number of factors, or domestic factors, of foreign policy strategy. But I think we're also quite fortunate that despite this deep polarization in Poland over the many years, we had a sense of a strategic direction where there is a bipartisan or multi-partisan agreement that security comes first. And that can be displayed by political manifestation, political manifestos of the current government, of the top spending of GDP on defense of Poland, among NATO countries in Europe at least. And it comes with a stronger sense than in many other European countries of citizens' willingness to fight. And you go and you can check Gallup's poll on the Europe's different countries across the world, but Europeans in particular, societies answering to, quite potential question, would you go and fight for your country in a defensive war? Would you stand up and fight? So Poles are here more united than many others behind this question. And that gives the maneuverability of the government to shape policies that will be, in my opinion, also impactful on Europe. We already see an impact on the strategic agenda of Europe, which before the change in October last year was so much focused on one priority, the key priority, economic security. But there was an addition, an amplification of two other aspects in the strategic agenda by now, which is democratic security, the first, the values pillar that is connected with international trade, of course, and the element of hard security, including border security. And you have the government and Prime Minister very vocal about the question of security for Europe, trying to reshape the discussion and mobilize policy momentum for doing more than Europe has been doing so far. Tomorrow we will have a leaders meeting in Poland, Minister of Foreign Affairs, meeting from Germany, France, possibly Italy, possibly Ukraine, possibly UK, to talk about how to shape the initiative throughout the presidency. But we know that the presidency will be all about security. There will be a dimension on hard security, and including border and including defense spending. There will be search for adjustment with potentially new government in Germany, and Friedrich Merz has spoken already that he would be willing to discuss the potential for defense debt, bonds, or whatever other forms of generating revenue for the war economy, as Thomas Gomard mentioned. So there is a question also of economic security, food security, the information security. All these slogans are, in fact, enormous policy areas that Europe hasn't been doing enough, and it will, with the new institutional cycle, have to show and demonstrate put some cards on the table. But I think that the key element here is not policies alone. It's the politics and the public opinion across Europe. Because politicians and policies, however sensible and strategic they might sound, they require public opinion standing behind that. And the ability to speak emotionally and invoke emotions among European societies, and there are very many plural and divergent views, with very strong already narratives and strategic narratives on appeasement, to keep it all together and focus not on the war, but on winning peace. That will be the key challenge to maintain any, sensible policy strategy that would be not costing any politician lost elections. I think this will be the biggest challenge, and the ability to communicate the necessary big effort, and that will need to come with a sense of a new deal, a new social contract for Europe, also in the sense of seeking those votes to believe that this is in the name of the European publics.
Thank you very much, Wojciech. And as you were speaking, I could see that Federica was thinking, this is interesting. How am I going to respond? So I'd like to ask you to do that. But let's not just, forget the original question. Is Europe fit for this? And I'd like you perhaps, look at EU, NATO-EU cooperation, which you inaugurated, and the strategic culture of Europe, because and I'm not saying anything new to say, there isn't much of a shared strategic culture. There are many divergent security threat perceptions across Europe. So, what progress has been made on that front? And then perhaps you could link it also to this question of public opinion and how to tackle the fact that in Europe we have conflicting narratives, not least about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and there are also many conflicting narratives about all sorts of things, but maybe let's just focus on that because that is clearly the sort of biggest security threat at the moment.
Thank you, Rosa. How much time do we have?
2 minutes, of course.
2 minutes, easy. I will start with the main question. Is Europe fit for that? Is the European Union fit for that?
Yeah.
I believe it can be, if it wants to, which is, I would say, quite an optimistic answer. Because I was in office when Trump was elected the first time. And it was a few months after Brexit, after the referendum. Then it took much longer, as you know, to accomplish the entire Brexit exercise. And at that time, summer 2016, so just before Trump was elected, and then for another 6-7 months, you might remember, everybody was saying this is going to be the beginning of the end of the European Union. Other countries will exit, and Trump will kill the European Union completely. And actually what happened, a few months later, I perfectly remember the moment, it was the anniversary of the Rome Treaties in March 2017. There was a moment where the leaders of the 27 remaining came together and said, okay, now it's a make it or break it moment. We have to recommit, and we have to stay united on Brexit negotiations. We need to stand together in front of whatever will come, because at the moment we didn't know what was coming. And indeed, we started the defense cooperation. We started the cooperation with NATO. That was actually at the Warsaw Summit. And we started to put the basis for the European defense. That was in the treaties already, but was never activated, let's say. So I believe that the key to the capacity to the European Union to react or to act in front of major crisis or challenges, as clearly we are facing today, is in the common perception of public opinions, of the seriousness and urgency to act together whenever there is a shared understanding of the magnitude of the phenomenon, then there is immediately the capacity to react. Take COVID, you mentioned that. Being Italian, the frustration in the first weeks was immense, but as soon as the perception of the magnitude of the threat came shared, then the reaction was fast, united, and very relevant. And it broke the taboo of going out on the markets and borrowing money together, which was unbelievable and inconceivable before, even if many had tried before. So, and the same, but the sad thing to that is that we needed a pandemic to do that, but we actually expanded the competences of the Commission beyond the treaties without treaty changes because it was needed and because there was political will to do it. And the health union started, unthinkable before. We needed a war, we needed a Russian invasion in Ukraine to deliver arms and to use the European Peace Facility to actually do something meaningful. At my times, I remember it took us months and months of endless debates to establish the European Peace Facility just to deliver non-lethal equipment. We were talking about uniforms and boots, something really with a minimal budget. So this to say, the European Union, I think it was Jean Monnet saying that, we need to perceive, we need to be on the edge of the disaster. In this, we're very much Balkans. We need to be on the edge of the disaster, look down and say, okay, no, maybe this is not where we want to go. And then the European Union is able to act fast and united and in very meaningful ways. So I think that we can be fit for the challenge if there is a shared political will and a shared perception of the magnitude of what we are in front of. Do we have that now? I think we could. On this, my impression is that in Brussels, so if you take the European institutions as such, if you take the Commission, if you take the Parliament, I think there is readiness to go in that direction. a lot will depend on domestic politics and trends in member states. What will happen with the German elections, with the French elections, whenever they will be, and the French government in the meantime. How different political trends in Central and Eastern Europe will develop. Because at the end of the day, the strategic guidelines of the European policies, of the European Union policies, are determined by the European Council. So it's the leaders around the table that set that kind of vision. So personalities count a lot in this. And for sure, Trump will try to take one by the other and follow, you know, the Roman divide et impera attempt. In 2016, it didn't work. I believe that it shouldn't work this time either, especially because out of the many different aspects that we highlighted, the 3 points, the economy, I think, will hit Europeans hard. So my impression is that even those that today are somehow celebrating Trump's victory in Europe, in a couple of months will realize that it's going to be tough for them too. And they will probably suffer the consequences of the tariffs or of the economic policies of the new administration quite hard. And I believe that the European Union can be the umbrella to, if not protect, at least bring together different Europeans, including those that today feel they might gain something out of the Trump administration, but actually I believe they won't. There was another question that was on, well, I think I answered that too.
I think you did,
the strategic
yes.
culture.
Yes, and I think, I mean, you're right. You know, it will take some time for Trump's allies in Europe, which are in the EU, but not just in the EU, also in other countries, to realize that actually MAGA policies will not necessarily help them.
Because, you know, in this attitude, if the logic of Trump is, as I believe is, to go unilaterally / bilaterally, okay? There's no country in Europe that is big enough to negotiate with Trump alone.
Yeah.
So, like it or not, you need the European Union in order to be strong enough at that kind of negotiating table. If multilateralism is not the way for Trump, then the only way in which any European can hope to gain something, or at least not to lose everything, is to sit at the other side of the table as Europeans and not as a single country. I think it was Spaak that was saying that in Europe there's not small and big countries, it's only countries that have not realized yet they're small.
Yeah.
I think we're there, right?
So we've talked about Trump, and we've talked about unilateralism, we've talked about isolationism, we've talked about MAGA. I mean, there's been a lot of speculation as to which Republican ideological tribe Trump will move towards. And what I'd like to ask you, Thomas, is what is this telling us about how US power is changing? Because we've been, you know, we've had the sort of American moments, then the end of the unipolar world, the challenge coming from China, from Russia. We have a bipartisan consensus in the United States that China's rise is an existential threat to the United States. So what kind, and then we have Biden coming in and putting back on the table the value of alliances, which actually I think Biden firmly believes that is a value, for good and for ill, because it's not, you know, the outcome of that belief is not necessarily always to our agreement. But what can we expect? How do you think sort of make America great again, the America that wants to impose tariffs, the America that wants to extrapolate benefits from allies? So there's no win-win here. It's us against them. What does that tell us about US power, and how should Europe as a whole try to adapt to that?
Let me give a short answer on that and then respond to a couple of the last comments. The Republican Party does not have an ideology. It has a system of obedience to the personality of Donald Trump.
Okay.
Whether in the future it will recover from that and again have some form of conservatism is unknown. I wanted to emphasize something that Federica said, which is, to expand on it, that one of the many similarities between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump is that each of them would prefer to negotiate with individual European countries and not with the EU, and certainly not with NATO. One of the basic tenets, I mean, again, just thinking of the theme of this conference in defense of humanity, one of the basic rules when you are facing an authoritarian regime as an individual or a party or an organization is do not obey in advance. Do not slide into apathy and accept that whatever the new authoritarian leader wants to do is inevitable. And this is advice I give everywhere in the US. But the advice applies to nation states as well. I am concerned that there would be a small parade of European leaders who will go to Washington before and after January 20th in order to build the best possible relationship with the Trump administration. That is traditional. But at this moment, it should not be the highest priority for any European leader. Rather, it is to reflect upon what is the strategic culture, the values, the priorities, the threats, and the interest of European states, and seek harmony within Europe. Consensus is difficult, I know that, and there will be some European leaders who can't wait to get their invitation to the White House. But the higher priority is defining your interests and seeking unity on that. Europe's record in foreign policy is mixed. Some great successes, some great frustrations. But I really believe it's an existential moment for European security today. And it applies particularly to Ukraine. I think that the European Union and European members of NATO must make some decisions in the next month or two about how strongly to support Ukraine. How much money, how much military aid, and maybe to make things a little bit more complex, how much money they want to spend on buying American weapons for Ukraine. Mr. Trump loves American weapon sales overseas. To fail to do that, to define that level of support for Ukraine, means you are putting Kyiv into a negotiation with no cards to play. And just as importantly, it's the future of the relationship with Russia. I have long believed that Mr. Putin wants both territorial expansion in imitation of past emperors and to have normalization of economic and political relations with the West. I have always believed he cannot have both. But whether I'm right or wrong about that depends primarily upon the actions of Europe in just the next few months.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And I'm glad because you allowed us to pivot towards Ukraine, and I think I'd like to use the next few minutes to do that. And I'd like to, because there's a lot of talk about, Trump saying we can have a peace deal in 24 hours, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, Europeans, there's been some talk in Europe. There's been a lot of activity, as Wojciech was saying, in trying to form a sort of coalition of the willing to pioneer Europe's response to Trump's election with respect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But Thomas, I turn to you because there's not much speculation as to what President Putin wants from this. I mean, you are an expert on Russia. What can you tell us about what Russia wants today? The US has now tried to accelerate and enable Ukraine perhaps to alter somewhat the rather negative a military situation on the ground. But what is Russia thinking, in your view? Again, we have to do some guesswork, but you're well placed to do it.
Well, I think that, you know, three main objectives for Putin. The very first one is to correct what was said by Barack Obama on Russia as a regional power.
Okay.
And I think on that, he will have another approach from the US. Second, clearly to destroy Ukraine. And third, to be back to 1997 in its relation with NATO. So to reconsider, to redesign the different NATO enlargements after 1997. That seems to me his main three objectives. So that's absolutely systemic, not only for Europeans, but for the transatlantic relations. I would add something else, which is very challenging for Europeans. It is the fact that before, you know, the massive attack in February 2022, we had this declaration between China and Russia with the so-called unlimited friendship, with three main points. The first one is to say great powers zone of influence. Second, human rights. That's not only boring, that's also very dangerous. And third, military alliances are not all the time necessary. So on these 3 points, I think that Donald Trump, if we follow his different statements, is in line with President Xi and President Putin, which is something very, very challenging for Europeans. And what is said by not only the Trump administration between during his first term, but also since, I would say, George W. Bush, you know, you have this idea that Europeans don't spend enough for their own defense and security. Many US administration did that. So there is all the debate, you know, for the so-called 2%, but I think that it's clearly now a new proportion which is asked for Europeans. And so Europeans should be, in my opinion, but I don't know if there will be, but should be able to reconsider the balance between security and prosperity.
So, sorry, let me just get this though, because the 3 points about Putin, they are unchanged. They are that is also what we were saying in 2022. So basically, none of the military fortunes would change the calculus from Putin's point of view, nor will the election of Donald Trump change the calculus, do you think? I mean, I'm just thinking, because there is growing discussion about what might be the terms for some kind of arrangement which Trump might want to, you know, call his own. But from your perspective, there will be no malleability coming from Moscow, even if it is with Trump, with...
No, from my point of view, the real strategic surprise, you know, is in fact the level of the Ukrainian resistance.
Okay.
That's the strategic surprise. So on that, Ukrainians send us different signals. There is a failure of their counteroffensive. There is the difficulties for recruitment, which is also visible on the Russian side, by the way. But we are approaching a point of approximately 1 million of killed people. So it's absolutely massive, you know. That's something completely forgotten by other Europeans. This level of losses, and there is another dimension which is certainly the most difficult to be analyzed and the most dangerous one. It is also the nuclear dimension. As soon as there is, you know, some attempts made by Ukrainians to go further or to reestablish position in the informative field, you have a statement on nuclear things. In fact, Russia is doing a colonial war under nuclear protection. And Europeans are unable to think in that terms, you know, because of course you have the nuclear dimension within NATO, but it's very, very difficult for current European leaders to reintegrate, you know, this nuclear grammar. So I think that the problem is indeed this sort of window of opportunity for European leaders to try to act by themselves very quickly in a complete new strategic configuration.
Okay. So I'd like to invite Federica and Wojciech to comment on this, but really briefly on this window of opportunity for Europeans, because I also need to open up the floor for questions and comments coming from our audience. So please prepare your questions and maybe signal that you want to contribute. I think there's probably a roving microphone. So Federica and Wojciech, do you want to just be really brief on, is there a window of opportunity for Europeans and what can be done in this respect?
Yes, there is. I think, indeed, we've talked for years, if not decades, of strategic autonomy. This is the moment to do it, and I think we've understood very clearly that this doesn't only apply to defense and military, hard security, but also to all other sectors of security, all those that you were listing before. I would add probably information, you mentioned that, energy, but everything relates to our security nowadays. I would say that one of the elements on which we can use this window of opportunities and strengthen somehow ourselves and our capacity to act is what I believe hopefully will happen, and that is the enlargement of the European Union finally. I think that one of the effects of the Trump administration coming in power will be hopefully that indeed we will have one or two new member states, if not more, joining the Union, and this would be relevant for the region, I think. And also to invest more on our security. But also I would like to comment on a couple of points, if I may, very quickly.
Of course,
one is the spending more. Indeed, the Europeans investing more on defense, actually this was agreed in the NATO Wales summit, so that was Obama 2014. Not just Bush, so a Democrat administration. But I very much agree with you. I think that Trump likes the idea not so much of Europeans spending more on defense, because when we committed to spending more on defense, on European defense systems, he didn't like that particularly. So I think it's, that is going to be a delicate element to see. Another point that maybe it's difficult to mention only very briefly, but I think that indeed you're very much right when you say the key point will be how much the Ukrainians can resist. I would say not only militarily, but also politically. My biggest nightmare is this, because we can support as much as they stand. Because at the end of the day, we always say it's for the Ukrainians to decide. And we know that Trump likes negotiating, not necessarily having everybody at the table. Let's put it this way. When he was talking to the DPRK, he was talking to the DPRK not always in presence of all the powers that needed to be around the table. When he was talking with the Taliban, I mean, not him personally, was not always doing that with the Afghan government at the table. My biggest nightmare is this. What if, at a certain moment, we have in Ukraine either a government or a public opinion wave that shifts from what I see is the basic principle of respect of international law, that you don't change borders with military action. That is, to me, the most traumatic scenario, which hopefully will not happen.
Thank you. I'm looking around the round. Great. So we have some questions. So Wojciech, maybe you can come in later. So we have a question here, and then there's another hand at the back. I can't see who the hand belongs to, but I can see the hand. So please, and please introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Georgi Oniani. I come from a small country, Georgia, which, it has already been mentioned, and I think, will be in the news in the coming weeks. The situation is really very difficult, and it's also can be judged from the panel, from a very interesting panel and very interesting discussions, but the situation and the picture you've painted is really very grim. And the grimmer picture gets when you go to the countries like Georgia, smaller countries which don't have either NATO or EU umbrella, and we're close to Russia. So we're basically being opened up to a vacuum where Russia will naturally kind of come and swallow us. So the question is, I want to basically rephrase your main question, which you just, I think it's...
Hopefully not an attack.
Hopefully it's friendly, yeah.
Drones at security conference.
So the question is there with all those risks in place, which you just very eloquently mentioned, is there a chance for success? Just look at those challenges with Trump being elected, with all the criticism, and probably a right one. So what are the chances of these corporations succeeding? Maybe there are some hooks which could work the both ways, because this is clearly existential. Obviously, it's existential for Ukraine, who is fighting this war for all of us, but also for some other countries as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like our panelists to hold that question, because I'd like to pick another one from the, and it's just to your left. The hand, you can see the hand, perfect. And again, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
You also see the body, I hope.
Now
So,
you can see you.
My name is Angel Petrov. I come from Bulgaria. I work for Dnevnik, which is a Bulgarian news outlet. A couple of questions, one directed at Mr. Gumar, the other at whomever it may concern. So, Mr. Gumar mentioned something interesting about this peculiar quartet of Trump, Musk, Thiel, Vance that we should look towards in terms of a futuristic vision that the next US administration might have. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit. Are you referring to this mixture of politics and tech, where tech will be ever more important? Are you referring to the fact that this will be a data-driven democracy, because big tech sided very easily with Trump, because it saw that looking at all American online consumer data, it saw where the tide was going? Are you referring to our tech and defense gap with the US? And do you think that it's possible to do anything about this Europe turning into a museum of technology, something that Ms. Merkel warned against maybe 20 years ago, and I think we are nowhere near solving this conundrum? And the second thing is about the trend that some people have mentioned of deprioritizing Europe, not just in terms of security, but in any other term you can imagine, starting back during the Obama administration. Biden, to some, looks like an exception rather than the rule in this new trend. Do you think Europe should prepare for a future where it will no longer be as relevant for the United States as it used to be in the second half of the 20th century? And what should it do about that?
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? Yes. Thank you.
So I'm Leonita Bayrami, journalist at Top Channel Albania. I have a question for all the panelists, if I may. What's the impact of this election, the election on the US and EU on the Western Balkans, especially on the Kosovo and Serbia relations and the path to normalization between the countries, specifically on the dialogue process? Are we near a solution between the countries?
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn back to you. You basically have a minute each, I'm afraid. So pick and choose, but there were, good questions there. I'm going to start with you, Wojciech, and I'm just going to go that way. So please, pick and choose, what can be possible successes, futuristic vision, Western Balkans.
I'll try to speculate on potential successes.
Yeah.
I mean, Ukraine war, despite all we say and all the wars we describe, can be won, not because the political leaders want it, but still there is an active civil society force that is relentless and goes against any type of narrative. What can and should be done is to fund the military spending that allows them to continue to win and to contain the aggression. Because the resources on the other side are also not infinite, but we shouldn't joke ourselves that they are not ramped up. And the West, collective West, need to do more. Very quickly, two, there's an opportunity with Mr. Trump fight on disinformation, because he wants to fight disinformation as a policy against disinformation. And that was the announcement that we heard. Europe can establish quite a lot of policy toolbox that will be for the media, safe media space and information space to actually address the power of the tech, which it started already doing. It can do more, not in an unfriendly manner, but in a way that it can bring benefits to also to the big media platform. And for China, we can completely use this moment in Europe to level playing field with China, which hasn't been done for the past years. China was ignorant about the necessity of that policy on trade, and on tariffs. And this may be a fortunate moment for Europe also to step up and also use some of its new toolbox on EV tariffs.
Federica, 1 minute.
I guess
Or less.
I'll have to take the Western Balkans one.
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't think that the election in the United States will have a major impact on the region. I might be wrong, and I know very well that in the region there have been different attitudes when it comes to the US campaign and the elections. But I don't think, traditionally, even during the first Trump administration, there was a certain continuity. That is basically translates into support for the European Union action in the region. It was the less controversial topic in foreign affairs that we had during that time. I think that the second Trump administration will be very different, so it's not a given. But I don't think it will have a major impact. It could have actually an impact in different terms. It could act as an accelerator of European presence, of European Union presence, sorry, because there's no need for European presence. This is already Europe. But for an acceleration of the European Union presence and hopefully an acceleration of the accession process on the candidate countries and potential candidates here, including, hopefully, I would say a revitalization, a new impetus, let's put it this way, to the dialogue. It might happen. This coincides with the new leadership in the European Union taking office. So I hope that this could give new impulse to positive developments on the negotiations.
Thomas, and you have the futuristic politics and technology question directed at you.
Yes, I try to respond to the question from our Bulgarian colleague. Well, two things. You know, I think that Trump, it's a sort of, Trump to me, that's similar to political pornography. But behind this pornography, there is something very serious in ideological terms. So that's maybe a point of disagreement with Thomas. And when J.D. Vance made a balance between NATO and DCA and DMA, that's very bad news for Europeans, but also very good news because that's reflecting the fact that regulation makes sense or has an impact. I don't know what will be the consequences on that, but just to attack so strongly, you know, DCA and DMA should lead us to the idea that the EU is very often blamed for regulating by opposition with innovating, but I think we should regulate very seriously. We should continue to do so, to refuse to become completely stupid, you know, by using social media, and to be able to have a political point of view on technologies.
Thomas, you have the final few seconds.
Okay, 2 points. On the Western Balkans, I agree with Federica. It will not change very much, the US election. Both Belgrade and Pristina are used to pointing at Washington and Brussels as the reasons that the dialogue is not advancing, and neither is EU membership. The fault is in Belgrade and Pristina, that they are not doing enough. And a change in US president doesn't change that fact. Let me try to close on an optimistic note. Can European Union foreign policy still be relevant in the world? The answer is absolutely yes, but it has to start by being relevant in Europe. Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump have fantasies of Yalta, where the two of them can get together and draw new lines on a map. They will do that with the absence of the European Union unless the EU makes some decisions and some policy and reaches some unity on that now. I am optimistic that the size of the existential security crisis for Europe that is involved in Ukraine will provide the impetus for the EU to prove again its relevance in Europe and in the world. Thanks.
So Serjan opened this conference quoting Gramsci, so I think I can throw in one of the quotations from Gramsci that I've been using a lot, and that is the pessimism of the mind, but the optimism of the will. I think we've had a bit of both here on the panel today, so please join me in thanking our speakers for their excellent insights. Okay, done.
So it was a great kickoff of this year's conference with discussions on Europe's response to challenges that US elections outcome generates, with the intention of revealing, reminding and drawing attention to the true democratic values of our societies and individuals who are the role models in our fight for the better and fairer tomorrow, for a future free from fear and insecurity, which is the vision of the Belgrade Center for Security Policy. Last year, we established the Lighthouse Award. The winner of the last year's award was Aleksandar Obradović, a whistleblower previously working in the arms industry. The aim of the Lighthouse Award is to honor exceptionally courageous individuals, women and men, whistleblowers working in the fields of security and foreign policy. The Lighthouse is a reminder of what virtues should adorn individuals in a society and in which direction should our societies go. The Lighthouse is a symbol of the destination we need to reach and the path we need to take to become better as individuals and as a society. The winners of the Lighthouse Award are brave individuals who light our way towards a better and more democratic society. This year, the Lighthouse Award will be given to a police major, Katarina Petrović. On the behalf of the Civilian Committee for the Protection of Human Rights Defenders and Whistleblowers of the Belgrade Center for Security Policy, the Lighthouse Award is presented by a member of the committee, an investigative journalist, Vuk Cvić, who was the first to write about the case of Katarina Petrović.
Dobroveče svima. Velika je čast dodeliti nagradu Katarini Petrović, profesionalcu u policiji koja je završila sve škole. Završila je Višu školu unutrašnjih poslova 2007. Policijsku akademiju 3 godine kasnije. Ona je major policije i od 2015. godine radila je na mestu šefa smene dežurne službe uprave policije u njenom rodnom Valjevu. Uhapšena je 3. jula prošle godine zbog sumnji da je navodno zloupotrebila položaj time što je iz informativnog sistema Ministarstva unutrašnjih poslova preuzela policijski izveštaj sa uviđaja saobraćajne nezgode koju je izazvao jedan od ljudi iz bliskog kruga predsjednika Srbije i njegov kum, Nikola Petrović. U izveštaju koje je nesumnjivo od javnog značaja i ne predstavlja nikakvu tajnu, navodi se da je taj čovek iz predsjednikovog okruženja pod dejstvom alkohola i kokaina izazvao nezgodu sa skupocenim automobilom u koji su povređene 2 žene. Ovim činom Katarina Petrović je sprečila predstavnike vlasti da zataškaju slučaj, što je običaj da oni rade, nažalost. I umjesto da bude nagrađena zbog hrabrog uzbunjivanja, izložena je progonu autoritarnog režima, ogrezlom u korupciji. Uhapšena je dok predsjednikov kum nije čak zadržan ni na trežnjenju. Protiv nje je bio poveden i krivični postupak koji je na kraju dobila. I dalje je suspendovana sa posla dok mi ovdje sedimo, ali je posvećena tom poslu i obavljala ga je u interesu svih građana. Ona je svojom hrabrošću i svojom profesionalnošću ukazala na nekažnjivost osionih pripadnika vlasti u Srbiji, za koje zakoni ne važe. Katarina Petrović sebe ne smatra junakinjom, ali za ovo društvo i sve nas njena ispravnost i nepokolebljivost je svetionik koji nam pokazuje put. Sa poštovanjem u ime civilnog odbora čestitam vam.
Hvala. Hvala.
Good evening, everybody. It is a huge honor that I'm here to give this award to Ms. Katarina Petrović, a professional working in the police force. She finished all the possible education in her profession, so she graduated from higher school of the Ministry of the Interior in 2007. She also, 3 years later, graduated from the Police Academy. She is a major in the police force of Serbia. And since 2015, she has been the head of one of the teams as part of her police administration in her hometown of Valjevo. She was arrested on the 3rd of July 2023, allegedly having abused her power, using the information system of the Ministry of the Interior and divulging a report which provided the details from the accident that had happened before and which had been allegedly caused by Mr. Nikola Petrović, who is a member who is close to the President of the Republic of Serbia, Mr. Vučić, and who is his best man. The report, even though it contained no secrets and even though it had its public importance, was not accepted well. Mr. Petrović was proven to be under the influence of alcohol and cocaine while driving a pricey car with which he caused an accident where 2 women were injured. He was, of course, not put in any kind of custody, or he was not detained for any time, even for the sake of sobering up. She was the person, our contestant today, who prevented this whole affair to be hushed down, which usually happens in this country. And in contrary, she was also subject to the authoritarian regime and its persecution. She was arrested while the person who caused the accident was not even kept to sober up. Criminal charges were pressed against Katarina, and she won in the proceedings. However, she is still suspended from her work and from her position. She still is committed to her work. Her bravery and professionalism are admirable. She pointed herself with her example to the impunity of the regime and members of the regime who do not pay for their consequences. She does not deem herself a heroine. She does not think that it was a heroic act. But her way and her moral principle and her true north in what she did is what is commended. And on behalf of the Civil Board, I congratulate you and give you this award.
Thank you. Da li se da čujem? Dobroveče svima. Velika je čast i zadovoljstvo stajati ovdje ispred vas i u ovoj ulozi dobitnika nagrade koja je svakako, osim što je jedna u nizu, je zaista vrlo mi je veliko zadovoljstvo da sam ja dobitnik nagrade koja nosi naziv svetionik i nadam se da sam nekome zaista svetionik. Ali ću vrlo kratko citirati patrijarha Pavla, odnosno pokušat ću da izgovorim rečenicu kojom ću objasniti moj postupak i ono što sam ja zapravo učinila. Rođeni smo kao ljudi i od nas se zahteva da to i budemo. A obavezni smo i u najtežim situacijama da postupamo kao ljudi i nema tog interesa niti ličnog, niti nacionalnog koji bi mogao da nam bude izgovor da budemo neljudi. Hvala vam.
Good evening, everybody. It is a huge honor and a pleasure to be here in front of you and also to be again in this new role as a recipient of this award. It is a great pleasure to be the recipient of the award, which is called the Lighthouse, and I truly hope that I will serve as a lighthouse to at least some people. I will thank you by quoting our head of church, Archbishop Pavle, by saying, who actually said, we were born as people and we have to stay people and act like people throughout our lives. There is not a single interest, whether it's personal or national, which will prevent us from being human beings. And there should be no excuses in our acts to stay human and not to act inhumanely.
Congratulations to Katarina Petrovic again, and of course to Vuk Cvijic for covering the story. Now, as we draw the first day of the conference to a close, I would like to thank all of you on behalf of the Belgrade Security Conference for your active participation. It was your engagement and expertise that have truly made this an exceptional start.
Tomorrow promises to be just as enriching, with another full day of panels, discussions, and networking opportunities. We will begin with registration at 9 a.m., so please ensure you arrive in time to collect your materials and settle in. The first panel of the day will commence promptly at 10 a.m., featuring another impressive lineup of speakers.
We invite you now to join us at the cocktail reception.
Thank you once again. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Enjoy the reception and the rest of your evening.